suggest an outline for what a North American Protestant Christian theology informed by the mimetic theory looks like. And I say Protestant because when Tony and I and Tom Nichols were originally forming Theology and Peace, one of the things we were aware of is that the major Girardian group, the Colloquium on Violence and Religion, the theology section in that group is dominated by discussion by the Roman Catholics, particularly those folks associated with Raymond Schwager, now deceased, in Innsbruck. And we were wanting a place to begin to discern and articulate what does Protestant doctrine look like. And that was important to us. And so Theology and Peace was formed with that in mind. Although we've managed, just as the Colloquium on Violence and Religion has managed to be ecumenical in its conversations, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, Theology and Peace has also managed to do that somewhat. But my interest is in a Protestant theology, and I say it because Protestants authorize their theology different than Roman Catholics. We authorize our theological models by appeal to the Scriptures, whereas the Roman Catholic Church will authorize its theology by an appeal to the teaching magisterium and the creeds of the Church. So, having said that, here's what I will do. First, I'm just going to, for a moment, talk about what I call the Babylonian captivity of the gospel. That's a play, of course, on Martin Luther's famous essay, I believe in 1521 or 1522, the Babylonian captivity of the church. We already know that the church has been held captive for a long time. We're just now, I think, really beginning to see that it's the gospel itself, the kerygma, the message of the cross of Christ, that has been held captive for far longer. Second, what I'm going to do is I want to talk about the warders or the guards that keep the gospel imprisoned in our theological models. And then finally, I want to offer some trajectories. So if we are going to construct a model of theology that really is gospel, that's good news, that benefits human beings, what does some of the trajectories of that look like in the light of mimetic theory? Bob Daly, a great scholar from Boston College, wrote an essay in the Colloquium's journal Contagion some years back, to which Paul Nectarline did the response. And Bob is, in that essay, talking about the problem of the Constantinian era. And for Bob, as for many folks that come from a tradition that is affirmative of the Nicene Creed, the Constantinian era is really a benefit. It's a boon to Christianity. But for Anabaptists, which I consider myself one, the Constantinian era is both a bane and a blessing. For the most part, however, I want to focus, at least for now, on the part that's the bane, the problem. And the problematic in this Constantinian time is that the issue of violence is submerged. The issue of violence is submerged as the empire and the church now become one in the figure of Constantine. And so what happens is violence begins to become justified in the life not only of the state but of the church. And it is scant 100 years later, St. Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, will say that the state has the right to use violence against heretics. And so Peter Brown, Augustine's biographer of the 80s, says that Augustine becomes the first theorist of the Inquisition. I have, in another place, traced this business of this downfall of the church back to the 2nd century, and I'll talk about it in a minute. But for now, what I want to observe is that René Girard, if he has to take a position on this business of whether the Constantine era was a blessing or a bane, comes down on the side of bane. He says, historical Christianity covers the biblical text with a veil of sacrifice, or to change the metaphor, immolates them in the, albeit splendid, tomb of Western culture. And in another book, book he says, beginning with Constantine, Christianity triumphed at the level of the state and soon began to cloak its authority with its authority, persecutions similar to those in which early Christians were victims. And in Evolution and Conversion, Rene correctly observes that there is a major problem with the official church historian Eusebius, who is Constantine's official biographer, and that with Eusebius, what we have is a writer who, in his first edition of his ecclesiastical history, is a pacifist. After Constantine comes to power and Eusebius decides to laud Constantine, Eusebius begins to sow the seeds of what will later become just war theory. So I'm saying that I am taking a different position than Bob Daly on the Constantinian era, and I'm willing to come down on this as an Anabaptist. Okay. With Rene and against Bob, what I want to ask is this. If there's a tectonic shift in the Constantinian time, if there's something that happened that created this shift from early church, early Christianity to something else, what was it? And what are the consequences? When I wrote The Jesus-Driven Life, I was interested in the shift in hermeneutics that took place, the shift in the way the church would interpret the Scripture. And that's what I did in The Jesus-Driven Life. Here, what I want to look at are the specific hindrances in theology today that create problems for those of us that preach and teach the gospel. And so I use the term warders, the guards of the gospel. And I note that in the New Testament, that which creates issues for the church in its proclamation of the Gospels goes under the rubric principalities and powers. That's the Pauline phrase. And Walter Wick, in his trilogy and some of his other works, has done a tremendous amount to show us exactly how these principalities and powers work themselves out, both in terms of social institutions as well as the spirituality of these institutions. And Walter also notices that if we're going to collectively refer to this business of the warders of the gospel as principalities and powers, we can do the same thing with the singular term hashatan, the Satan. Rene, also independently of Walter, notices this. He says, though not identical with Satan, the powers are all his tributaries because they're all servants of the false gods that are the offspring of Satan. That is the offspring of the founding murder. What we're talking about here are rather the social phenomenon that the founding murder created. For those of us that have to preach and teach this business, and we go, okay, how do we talk to our congregations about the principalities and powers? What is the Satan? What is the devil? How do we do this? One thing we want to know is that the concept of the devil has changed over time. And Jeffrey Burton Russell has a beautiful 4-volume set in which he describes the archaic devil, the Christian Satan, the medieval Lucifer, the modern Mephistopheles. And then there are many other books that do kind of take this trajectory of tracing this changing satanic figure from the earliest times that this is recognized until the present. So the Satan's gone from being a member of the divine court, like we find in the book of Job, where we have a figure that simply goes to and fro, who is the prosecuting attorney. And in the book of Job, Satan is essentially the attorney general or the Rudy Giuliani of God's administration. And he becomes, in later Jewish mythology, a fallen angel, because Judaism has to deal with the problem of theodicy following the exile. And so one of the things it's got to do is explain the origin of evil. And so what it does is it says, well, God created these spiritual powers, and some of them rebelled, came down to earth, corrupted us, we rebelled, and so all of us can do the Flip Wilson routine and blame it on the devil. Those of you that laugh are dating yourselves. And of course, the Satan will become, by the time the early church is writing, the accuser of the brothers and sisters, the one who is the finger pointer. And I'll come back to this in a bit. What Renee has done for us is to make the case that Satan is not a theological category. Satan is an anthropological category. This is huge. Because if we no longer conceive of the Satan in transcendent categories, in metaphysical categories, as some kind of an angelic spirit that's out there trying to get us, if in fact the Satan is us, then we have to reckon with the fact that the origins of evil don't stem from outside the human species, but indeed stem from within our own hearts. So how does this evil, scandalous thinking manifest itself? How has historical Christianity been compromised? Where has the gospel been brought into submission to the powers? In his book, Christ and Postmodern Philosophy, I had to look at the footnote for a moment there. Frederick Deportera says, when Christianity entered the pagan world, which had, in contrast to the Jews, not been prepared by the demystifying effect of the Hebrew Scriptures, sacrificial Christianity became inevitable. This resulted in re-sacralization. God was re-infused with violence. What Deportera's argument is that you have this revelation, this gospel of the nonviolent God in Jesus, but because paganism did not have that mediating tradition, these texts in travail, the Hebrew Scriptures, this Jewish engagement of the people of God as they're coming out of paganism into this new revelation, and they're struggling to grasp this compassionate, merciful, loving God while they're still stuck in archaic thinking patterns of gods needing sacrifice. They don't have this mediating tradition that allows that. So what happens is, it's inevitable that Christianity, as soon as it moves onto Gentile soil, as soon as it loses touch with its Jewish roots, has to become sacrificial. That's the way the Greek philosophical world thinks. Well, what I'm going to do is list 7 key areas that Christian theology has been co-opted by this satanic principle. I'm going to deal with the issues of philosophy, epistemology, sociology, psychology, economy, spirituality, and theology. First, that's it. And then we got to get to the next part of the essay. That's why I put it in print. You can just, go read it. Philosophically, one of the warders of the gospel is the violent logos. Now, those of you that have read things didn't know this from Renee. You know that the problem occurs in that the logos of Greek philosophy, the structuring principle of reality, because that's what logos means. And you all know the trouble Faust had, Goethe's Faust had, trying to translate John 1. When I come to John 1, is logos word? Is it deed? Is it action? What is this logos thing? It's a structuring principle. It's the way we conceive of the whole of reality. In Greek philosophy, that structuring principle is polemos, war, conflict, violence. And Girard says that the logos of the Gospels is nonviolence. Well, what happens then is that in the 2nd century, with the first great Christian philosopher, Justin Martyr appropriates the logos tradition of Greek philosophy and assimilates it to the logos of John 1 without thinking that there's a difference between the violent logos and the non-violent logos. And Brian McLaren, Tony Bartlett, and others have shown that this marriage of categories is not beneficial. Renee's not the only one to do this. Brian says in one of his books that this relationship between the two logoi alters the narrative structure of the gospel. Tony, in his recent book, Tony, what's the name of it? I'm blanking. Virtually Christian, says that when you mix Platonism and the gospel, you produce a cosmic thud of eternal principles. I love that. Okay. And Renee will go on to say that this assimilation of the two logoi, the two different the logos of the Greek traditional logos of Christianity, is, quote, the strangest and most durable illusion of Western thought. So right off the bat, we've got a problem. When we mix the logos of John 1 with the logos of Greek philosophy. And once your Christology does this, you're doomed. Your Christology is absolutely doomed. Because at that point, you can no longer talk about the nonviolent Jesus. Epistemologically, René has made the case that the originary murder, the first victim, initiated the process of civilization and language. I'm not going to go into all the detail here, because then we would have to deal with Eric Gans and Derrida and any number of these other philosophical people. And Tony Bartlett is much better at this philosophy stuff than I am, because I really don't do philosophy well. It gives me agita. But the victim is the first binary, the first dualism, the first thing that can be both demonized and divinized. And as a result, as Tony says, in her switch, that is, in the victim's switch, from good to evil, that is, when we make the victim sacred, this victim makes available an on-off switch, a dualism, a binary, opposites, with astounding and world-ordering power. What this means is that we are literally constituted dualistically in our evolution. We cannot but be dualistic in our thinking. What Zoroaster brings into Eastern thought 800 years before Jesus, what Heraclitus and Plato and Aristotle bring in the 300, 400, 500 years before Jesus, is not something new. They're just articulating that which is already there. Philip Lee, in his book Against the Protestant Gnostics, and if you don't know this book, and you are a Protestant, you want to read it, Against the Protestant Gnostics, makes the case that whether you are fundamentalist, conservative, liberal, or progressive, your theological heritage is dualistic, and it has detrimental results for the way you do theology in North America. A few examples. There's the dualism between spirit and matter, body and soul, objective and subjective. There's the two-kingdom theory. We've got God's love and God's justice, eschatology and ethics, heaven and hell, time and eternity, election and free will, natural and supernatural, Israel and the church, us and them, men and women, gay and straight. We organize ourselves dualistically. And that is because the result is because we have locked our thinking into violence done to a victim. Number 3, the third order of the gospel. Sociologically, the satanic can be found in blame, accusation, and punishment. The ultimate satanic gesture is this. That's the ultimate satanic gesture. And if you want to hang out with even the Garden Brother, says a lot about your character. I would have chosen Mary Magdalene before her conversion, but hey.
Well, you're not out.
I know, that's it. I'm not out. When Christian communities submit to the satanic in formation of social groups, they will always manifest an us versus them mentality. We are this, we are not that. We're Baptists, we're not Lutherans. We're Lutherans, we're not Episcopalians. We're Anabaptists, we're not Reformed. We're Reformed, we're not Catholic. We're Catholic, we're not Orthodox. We're this, we're not that. The inevitable result is the codification of a belief system that will eventuate in some form of scapegoating. That scapegoating can take place as real execution. Look at the Inquisition, the Protestant witch hunts, or the Holocaust. Can also take place in the form of exile, if you're an Anabaptist, shunning, displacement and marginalization, and Christian history is replete with examples, and I don't need to tell you them, you can easily number them. The corollary aspect to this business sociologically, to accepting blame, accusation, and punishment, is when we affirm that revenge is a form of justice. Now this blew my mind. This comes from less than 2 weeks ago, March 14th, 2011, the New York Daily News did a poll. And they were asking the question relating to the death of Osama bin Laden. And in that poll, they said, I better quote this so I'm not blowing smoke out of the nether parts of my body. Do you believe in exacting revenge to get justice? That was the question that polled some 1,500 people. Only 28% said revenge was barbaric. 16% said it depended on the situation. And 56% revenge is the only sure way to achieve justice. 72% of the people polled in this so-called Christian nation, followers of Jesus, the Prince of Peace, revenge is the only way to get justice. I don't know about you, but it says that in my Bible. Amen. Then you got Sarah Palin driving into D.C. last weekend on motorcycles, you know, and irritating the vets that she's upstaging them, and somebody interviews her and she says, I love the smell of emissions. And I thought, dear God, we've got a motorist president, man. We don't know what she'll be sniffing. Well, I told you I go down these rabbit trails, but I should just stick to my notes. Number 4, psychologically, Christian anthropology that constitutes the individual as an atomistic presence has bought into the romantic lie. That is Renee's term, the romantic lie. The lie that I am a rock, I am an island. Okay? With no offense meant to Paul Simon. The satanic spirit manifests itself in this anthropology when it says that I am responsible for my own eternal, meaning Platonic, salvation. I, me, mine. I said the prayer at the end of the track. I saved myself. I'm going to heaven. There are also other ways this Christian psychology manifests itself. I will just note some. There is the turn to mysticism. I mean, we live in a consumer culture, folks, and if you go to the Bible bookstores, you go to the Christian bookstores, you go to the secular bookstores, it doesn't matter. We have got 1,000 books on how to improve your spiritual life, how you can feel better about your own little spiritual navel-gazing thing you do. Legalism is another form that this atomistic, individualistic psychology produces. It essentially says that it's about I, me, my. I keep the rules. I'm going to heaven. You don't keep the rules. You're not. Doctrines of justification and sanctification. If you're Lutheran here, say amen. Okay? Doctrines of justification and sanctification. They're no longer tied to communal identity, which Pauline studies today recognizes that that's what's going on with justification and sanctification. It's not about how can I find a gracious God. That's not the question Paul was asking. That's the question Martin Luther was asking, but it's not the question Paul was asking. Doctrine becomes narcissistic when it's viewed as the linguistic expression of inner feeling, what George Lindbeck calls the experiential expressive notion of doctrine. It's empty of any possibility of truth. What's truth? Oh, well, what's true for you, brother, is true for you. What's true for me is true for me. What's true for the sister here is true for the sister there. I mean, true what's truth? Who could know? It's just another form of narcissism. Number 5. Economically, the 5th order of the gospel. It's been observed that some 40% of Jesus' teaching uses economic metaphors. Folks, Jesus was a severe critic of economics long before Karl Marx came on the scene. Girardians Jean-Pierre Dupuy and Paul Dumichel have demonstrated in their work that the modern economy replaces sacred religion in the modern world. That is, the role of the economy today functions for us in the same way that sacred religion functioned. Are we ready, Eddie? Okay. Order number 6. Christian discipleship, or spirituality, is badly mangled when it becomes oriented to law, or to the 2 pillars of culture, ritual and prohibition. When Christian spirituality is oriented to law, it easily degenerates into holiness codes. And God knows that Protestantism is full of every kind of sect and cult. that has oriented itself to some set of rules and regulations. In fact, I'll give you a funny story. Back when I was born again, see, I was Roman Catholic, so I was going to hell, and the Baptists knew that, so they needed to save me. And they did. I got saved. Only instead of getting saved, from a heaven to hell, I kind of went from hell to the worst hell. But that's neither here nor there. But in the process of getting saved, we used to, on Communion Sundays, recite the Apostles' Creed in the back of the hymnal. So you flip to the back of the hymnal, the whole congregation would stand up. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, His only Son, our Lord, and in the Holy Spirit, and in the Holy Christian Church, because of course we're Catholic, world without end, and I will not drink alcohol. Now, I didn't know that was part of the creed. And I was 18, and that wasn't right. So, when you orient Christian spirituality to holiness codes, to ritual and prohibition, you have to do this way, you can't do that way, you have to do what you're doing a certain way, or you're doomed. At that particular point, you miss the gospel and you turn it into something it is not. It becomes doisangelion, bad news. In the Jesus-driven life, I pointed out there are two recent works of the Apostle Paul that every pastor in this country needs to read. One is Lou Martin's commentary on Galatians in the Anchor Bible series. In that book, Lou Martin is able to make an extraordinary case that the apocalyptic element in the Apostle Paul entirely does away with Torah. And then Douglas Campbell, last year, produced a great big fat book, 1,000 pages. Took me 3 days to read this thing. It was huge. What are you laughing at? That's a long time for me. Big fat book called The Deliverance of God. And he reinterprets Romans 1 through 4. And does the same exact thing. Well, Bob Hamilton Kelly had already done this in 1994 in his book Sacred Violence from a mimetic theory perspective. There is a whole new way of reading Paul that we have got to get handles on if we are not only going to understand Paul, but what the role and function of Torah is both in the Bible and in the Jewish and Christian tradition. Last, number 7, and perhaps of greatest importance. Thank you, sir. All right. Christian theology is seduced by the satanic when it appropriates a sacrificial hermeneutic, when it makes the God and Father of Jesus to be like the gods of archaic religion who require blood sacrifice to appease divine wrath. Renee, Raymond Schwager, James Allison, Paul Nectarline, many of you here, Tony, I could go around the room and say, have made major contributions to the exegesis of the Bible that overturned the logic of this sacrificial kind of thinking. Like dualism, the sacrificial hermeneutic is easy to find in virtually any Christian doctrine. And what's especially amazing is that those that use a sacrificial hermeneutic not only justify it, but they say it's orthodox, when it is anything but. And so I conclude this section with a quote from Renee who says, "The sacrificial reading is unable to conceive of a God that would be absolutely free of violence, which is what the gospel text is really all about." So that brings us now. How do we develop a non-sacrificial theology? How do we talk about the gospel in the language that we are used to, the doctrines we are used to, the doctrine of God, Christology, pneumatology, ecclesiology, eschatology, spirituality, ethics, etc. So I'm not going to have time to really go through this. I will ask you to look at my paper for further insights, but I do want to point out just a few things to you. There is a theologian today who has just discovered the mimetic theory in the last 2 years. This particular theologian, however, prior to that, had begun to develop a theological model that is so congruent with the model of theology that can be found when you use the mimetic theory that it's absolutely astonishing. And that's Laurent Schultz, who teaches at the University of Agder in Norway. And what Laurent has done is he's been able to go from the theological side of things to the scientific side of things. In the same way, Rene went from the scientific side of things to the theological side of things. If you're not familiar with Schultz's work, I encourage you to get busy. He is an ally for those of us that are doing this business.
Can you spell Laurent?
Laurent, L-E, capital R-O-N. You can get the paper. The paper has his... First, let me just run real quick here. I'm just going to take like 1 or 2 minutes for each of these things. Doctrine of God. When we construct the doctrine of God, there are 2 key things we have to keep in place. One is a doctrine of the Trinity. Mary McKinney said that this morning. But it's essential. And if you're Anabaptist, you've got a problem because you've thrown out the Nicene Creed when you never should. Okay? I'm hanging with the Anabaptists these days, and for the love of God, I can't figure out why they claim to be non-creedal, but they're just kind of mixed up. You have to hang on to this business of what's going on in Nicaea. Something significant is being done in this creed. Theological thinking is occurring that is absolutely profound. But you cannot do that thinking apart from the Lutheran principle of a theology of the cross. Because you cannot talk about God abstractly. The place to begin is with Jesus' death. Who is the God that is revealed in the death of Christ? This is the whole point of doing post-Holocaust theology. Think Elie Wiesel here. We have to begin with the death of Jesus. We have to begin with the victim. That's the place we have to ask about the question of God. Not philosophical categories of goodness to the nth degree, beauty to the nth degree, these kinds of things. That's just Greek philosophy. This is why you have to get atonement right before you can discern who and what is being revealed. That is, who is this God that comes to us in Jesus' death? Dietrich Bonhoeffer saw this in 1933 when he lectured on Christology at Berlin University. He said, it's not the abstract metaphysical question of how did God become human? How do we talk about the divine and the human in Jesus? How can we speculate about the character of divinity and humanity? He says the how question is not the primary question. It is the who question. Who comes to us? Who comes to us? This who is Christ crucified. And it's the passion or the death that renders all other textual meaning. And Rene has affirmed this. It's the passion kind of functions as this canon within a canon. That you have the passion as the center. It interprets the Gospels. The Gospels then interpret the New Testament. The New Testament interprets the Hebrew Bible. And the Hebrew Bible interprets paganism. That's how it works. The Christian doctrine of God also confesses, and I'm not being politically correct here, I'm being confessional, that Jesus is the full, the final, and the complete revelation of the character of God. I didn't say God's being. God help us with being language. I said God's character. It's not just part of God that gets revealed in Jesus. Too many of our evangelical friends, man, Jesus is the good guy. God is, get a little worried about, the Father. Well, it's true. I mean, when I grew up, it was always, wait till your father is. Whoa, but it was never my father that beat me. It was always my mother. But we won't go into my own personal psychology. But Christians act like that. Yes, Jesus will save me from my sins, but you never know about God, man. Sometimes I think God needs medication. It's God's fullness, His pleroma, Colossians 2:9, that is incarnate in flesh in Jesus. Christology. The who question is answered in the doctrine of God. But now we come to the how question. But if we're not going to ask the how question, how did God become man in some kind of anselmic fashion, with great philosophical categories, how do we answer the how question? Real simple. We go to the last 100 years of the life of Jesus research. We learn everything we can about the context of Jesus, His culture, the groups in His culture, the literature of His culture. Everything we can, because as we learn more about the groups and the types of people and the issues that arise in Jesus' culture, the better we can context them. And a text without a context is a pretext. And Jesus is our text. So we have got to do serious exegetical work when it comes to the Gospels. I can't say enough about this. If you are a pastor, I urge you to buy Josephus, the Pseudepigrapha, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Midrash, the Mishnah. Read this literature, the Apocrypha, get to know it. Don't just be reading your damn Bibles all the time. It's true. The Bible's not its own context. Sorry.
A lot of editing on this one.
How Jesus acts is an imitation of His Abba, or His Imma, if you prefer. The kindly, compassionate, gentle, nurturing one that He calls Abba. The who question of Jesus' identity in the fourth gospel can be understood now with reference to the how question of His mission and activity in the synoptics. We don't have to separate out the fourth gospel from the synoptics like historical criticism has been doing for the last 300 years. Walter Witt's already showed us historical criticism is bankrupt. I don't know why we keep buying into it. It's the only method that's out there on the market when it's not. Because the Emmanuel of Matthew is the logos of the fourth gospel. And here's another thing. If we're going to recite the Nicene Creed Sunday by Sunday, do you really know what we're saying? Can you imagine this? If we ever told the Baptists this, they would freak out. If you say, Jesus is homoousios with the Father, of the same substance, made of the same goo. If Jesus is homoousios with the Father, and if Jesus is non-violent, then guess what? You've just made a statement about the character of the Father. The Father is non-violent. The Nicene Creed is our greatest ally right now when it comes to tackling the problem of the violent God. When it comes to atonement, I have 5 points. Gosh, Tony said I should have focused on this. I'm running out of time. Real fast. Okay, here we go. Number 1. There's been a total and a complete deconstruction of penal satisfaction theory in atonement literature. When I went to write my essay for Stricken by God, I read 40 books on atonement that have all been published since 1990. It's absolutely astonishing. In particular, the Girardian books published on the atonement, Cross Purposes by Tony, Saved from Sacrifice by Mark Hine, Rainer Schwager's work, James Allison's work, Robert Hamilton Kelly's work. It's absolutely amazing. You can look at the paper for the first point here about the literature that relates to the deconstruction of the penal satisfaction theory. For me, suffice it to say, the thing is dead. It's gone. Second, the Christian doctrine of atonement is a direct challenge to sacrificial theories of Jesus' death that make God responsible or complicit in the murder of His Son. You know, folks, the debate around atonement since the mid-'80s is the hottest debate on atonement in the history of the church. You can go through the whole of Christendom and never see a debate on atonement like you see going on right now. And it's very exciting for Girardians, because guess what, man? We are on the front lines. We are riding the crest of a wave, because René in 1978, when he published Things Hidden in French, opened the door for a new way to conceive of the death of Jesus that directly challenges Augustine and Brother Calvin. By the way, when John Calvin was doing what we would call his graduate work, you know, he was trained to be a lawyer. And you know what the nickname his classmates gave him was? The accusative case. And I happen to like Calvin. Okay. But we can no longer discuss atonement as though René and his theory does not exist. Third, Jesus' death is a complete renunciation of the sacrificial understanding of the atonement. Those authors that are out there on the market today that go, oh, there's the Christus Victor theory, there's the moral influence theory, there's the penal satisfaction theory, there's the substitution theory. We can hold them all together, one big happy family, are deluded. You cannot hold sacrificial and non-sacrificial theories together, because the moment you try to put them together, you end up with a Janus-faced God. A God who's schizophrenic. A God who's an alcoholic in the sky. You never know what you're going to get. That's why I said at the beginning, you can't get God right till you get atonement right. And you can't mix the theories. It's like trying to mix, I don't know, Jell-O and dog food. It doesn't work. That's not the case. 4, the death of Jesus is the space where God has revealed His Trinity. In the cross, the Father was reconciling the world. 2 Corinthians 5, 16 to 21. The Son models this reconciliation in the repetitive forgiveness of His enemies. Luke 23, 32. By the way, you know, there's a bunch of one-offs by Jesus on the cross. I'm thirsty. It is finished. Hey, you're going to be with me in paradise, buddy? The phrase, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Yeah, it's a textual variant. I understand this, okay? It's also imperfect. There's an iterative quality to it. It's as though Jesus was saying it over and over and over and over and over and over again. It's the only saying from the cross with repetition. It's a ritual. So there's a whole thing here we're going to pack on to. Okay. Finally, the Spirit sent from the Father through the Son in the cross. By the way, this comes from the Gospel of John. John's pneumatology. John does not have Pentecost. That is the gift of the Spirit after the resurrection. Because for the writer of the Gospel of John, the Spirit is given in the cross. And you have to go read John 7:37 to 39 and its background to pick that up. Eschatology, I just got a brand new book on that. We've got Tony's in that book, Jürgen Moltmann, Walter Wink, Richard Bauckham, Jay Phelan, Barbara Rossing. What we need today is we don't need a dualistic eschatology where Brian, I should have had to review this thing for the back cover since you didn't have it. But when Lori and I were trying to frame how we understand eschatology, and she said, well, what is it? And I kept telling her what I didn't believe. And she said, well, what do you believe? I tried to spit that out. I find it's a whole lot easier to say what I don't believe than what I do believe. But by the time I spit out what I do believe, she said, oh, you have a compassionate eschatology. Oh, that's a marvelous phrase. So we made a conference around that theme. That's what we need today, a compassionate eschatology. Poor brother camping needs to learn this.
Yes.
All right, so there's more on this in the paper. And finally, on this theme of compassionate eschatology, I want to say this. Christian eschatology that has a coherent, consistent doctrine of the Trinity grounded in the theology of the cross is going to recognize that not only are all things made through Christ, but all things are reconciled in Christ, whether on heaven or on earth. The creation itself, the air or water, the wind, the butterfly, the blade of grass, the deer, the fox. It's all part of us, and we are all part of it. Individuality in the Girardian sense does not stop here. We are interconnected with everything. This is where quantum theology, people like Yarvin or Merkel, are so important. We've got to learn to think in these categories. Well, here's what happens. I need that. When you create a theology that is orthodox, evangelical, and Anabaptist, you'll notice that on the right side of this chart is the mimetic theory. Oh God, I got to take these off. I can't see what it is. This is the mimetic theory as you know it. This is orthodox theology as you know it. Whoops. Right. I knew that. There's the mimetic theory. I'll show you. It's also up here. Here's your orthodox theology. Look at the structure. They're the same. Look at that. See that? They're the same. So when Rene says the mimetic theory vindicates all the great doctrines of Christian theology, he's absolutely right. This is it, man. We can do theology now with courage and vigor in ways that our forefathers and foremothers could never do. We can preach the gospel that redeems, transforms, reconciles, saves in a way our predecessors could never do. We have a message, and we have a mission, and we have a commission, and that's why you're here. If you're only here to get your intellect stimulated, well, go find another conference. But if you're here because you believe in the God who made all things and loves all things and redeems all things, then go preach the good news of the gospel. That's really what it's all about. Thank you. Don't clap yet, because I want to do something. Adam, you ready for that? I want you to close your eyes, because I'm a musician. Theology for me is more than just the mind. It's the heart, it's the soul. And I'm going to play you a short 5-minute violoncello thing from a European band that captures for me in musical tone what this gospel thing here is all about. So relax, Adam. Let it